The crash of porcelain against marble was what did it, a sound so sharp and sudden that every head in the crowded tea room turned at once, and Sable Renfield wished, with every fiber of her being, that the floor would simply open and swallow her whole. The teacup had slipped from her fingers mid-pour. That was all. One moment she'd been standing behind the refreshment table at Lady Ashwick's charity luncheon, doing the job she'd been hired to do: serve, smile, remain invisible. And the next, a stream of scalding Earl Grey was cascading down the front of a man's dove-gray waistcoat. Not just any man. The room had gone silent with the particular quality of silence that meant someone important had been inconvenienced, and Sable knew, before she even looked up, that this was going to be catastrophic. "I am so sorry," she breathed, grabbing the nearest linen napkin and pressing it against his chest without thinking. "I didn't see you. You stepped forward just as I was." She stopped. Her hand was pressed flat against a stranger's chest, the napkin already soaked through, and she could feel the warmth of him beneath the ruined fabric. She was touching him. In public, in front of at least 60 people who were watching with the focused attention of spectators at a blood sport. She snatched her hand away as if burned. The man looked down at his stained waistcoat, then at the shattered teacup on the floor, then at Sable. He was tall. She had to tilt her chin to meet his gaze, with dark copper hair that caught the light from the tall windows, and eyes the color of winter sage, pale green threaded with gray. His face was angular, almost severe, with cheekbones that cast shadows, and a mouth set in a line that could have been irritation or amusement. She couldn't tell which. "That," he said, his voice low and unhurried, "was a rather dramatic introduction." It wasn't an introduction. It was an accident. Sable's face was burning. She could feel the stares like heat on her skin. Lady Ashwick's charity luncheon, the most exclusive event of the spring calendar, and she'd just doused a guest in tea. Mrs. Pemberton, who ran the catering agency that had hired her for the afternoon, was going to dismiss her on the spot. Accidents don't usually involve quite so much physical contact, he observed, glancing at the wet napkin she still clutched in her fist. "I was trying to help. By pressing yourself against me in front of the Marchioness of Loudoun and her entire social circle." Sable followed his gaze and felt her stomach drop. An older woman in burgundy silk was watching them with the delighted expression of someone who'd just been handed the most exquisite piece of gossip. Beside her, 3 younger women whispered behind gloved hands, their eyes bright with scandal. "They're going to talk about this for weeks," the man said, almost conversationally. "I'll be dismissed within the hour," Sable replied, more to herself than to him. "Mrs. Pemberton doesn't tolerate scenes." Something shifted in his expression. "You work for the catering service?" "I serve tea at events, or I did, until approximately 30 seconds ago." She bent to gather the broken porcelain, grateful for the excuse to hide her face. "Again, I'm deeply sorry for the inconvenience to your waistcoat." "Forget the waistcoat." She looked up, surprised by the change in his tone. He was studying her with an intensity that felt almost physical, as if she'd become suddenly interesting in a way that had nothing to do with spilled tea. "What's your name?" he asked. "That's not really relevant, sir." "It's relevant to me." A woman in pale yellow appeared at his elbow, her expression tight with barely contained fury. "Harlan, darling, what on earth happened? Your waistcoat is ruined. Shall I have someone fetch?" "It's fine, Marguerite. It most certainly is not fine. This girl," the woman's gaze swept over Sable with dismissive efficiency, the plain black dress of the serving staff, the hair pinned too simply, the absence of jewelry, status, consequence. "This girl should be more careful." "She should," the man, Harlan, agreed. But he was still looking at Sable, and his expression held something she couldn't read, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Another woman materialized, this one older, stout, red-faced with mortification. Mrs. Pemberton. Your Grace, I cannot apologize enough. This girl will be dealt with immediately. Renfield, come with me. Now. Your Grace. The two words detonated in Sable's mind like a cannon shot. She'd just poured boiling tea down the front of a duke. She'd pressed a napkin against a duke's chest. She'd been standing close enough to smell his cologne, sandalwood, and something sharper, like cold air, and she hadn't even known who he was. That won't be necessary, the Duke said, his voice carrying the effortless authority of someone who never needed to raise it. Miss Renfield and I were just having a conversation. Mrs. Pemberton blinked. A conversation, Your Grace? Yes. A rather interesting one. He turned back to Sable, and there it was again, that calculating look, as if she were a key he'd found, and was now trying to determine which lock it fit. In fact, I believe Miss Renfield's services may be required elsewhere this afternoon. Sable's mouth opened. Nothing came out. What on earth was happening? Mrs. Pemberton retreated with the speed of someone who understood that proximity to power was valuable, but interference with it was fatal. Sable stood frozen, broken porcelain still in her hands. I don't understand what's happening. You will. He gestured toward a doorway leading to a smaller, private salon. Walk with me. I don't walk with strangers. You poured tea on me. I think we're past formalities. You still haven't told me your full name. He paused, and she saw surprise flicker across his face, that she genuinely didn't know who he was. In his world, anonymity was impossible. But Sable didn't read society pages. She read penny novels and poetry from the lending library, and she spent her days serving tea to people who looked through her like she was made of glass. Harlan Ashcroft, he said, Duke of Thornmere. The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Even Sable, who paid no attention to the aristocracy, had heard of the Duke of Thornmere. His estate was the largest in the eastern counties. His family's wealth was the kind measured not in pounds, but in generations. You are the one they call the Winter Duke, she said before she could stop herself. His expression cooled. I see my reputation precedes me. The kitchen staff talk. They say you haven't smiled in public since your wife died. Horror flooded through her. His wife. His late wife. The details were foggy, gleaned from overheard whispers while she polished silver. But she remembered the tone. Reverent, pitying, fascinated. I'm sorry, she said quickly. That was unforgivably rude. It was direct. There's a difference. But his jaw had tightened. Come with me, Miss Renfield. I have a proposition, and I'd rather discuss it without an audience. She should have refused. She was a tea server. He was a duke. But curiosity was Sable's greatest weakness. Her mother called it recklessness. Her brother Dashiell called it trouble. Sable called it the inability to walk away from an unanswered question. She followed him. The private salon was small, elegantly furnished, and mercifully empty. Harlan closed the door, not fully, leaving it ajar by several inches, a concession to propriety that surprised her, and turned to face her. You're articulate, he began without preamble. Well-spoken, educated, clearly from a respectable background despite your current employment. You're also unknown. No one in that tea room recognized you as anything other than staff. Because I am staff. Today you are. But that's not what you were raised to be, is it? The accuracy of his observation was like a blade slipping between her ribs. She wanted to deny it, but what was the point? He was right. She was the daughter of a naval captain who died at sea when she was 14, leaving behind a proud name and nothing else. Her mother had sold everything, the house in Hartlebury, the furniture, the silver, to keep Sable and Dashiell fed and clothed. There had been enough for a modest education, enough for manners and music and French, but not enough for a future. What do you want? She asked, stripping all pretense from her voice. "You didn't bring me in here to compliment my diction. I need someone to play a role, a very specific role, for a very specific duration." "What role?" "My potential match." Silence. "I'm sorry. Did you just ask a tea server to pretend to be your romantic interest?" "It's practical." He turned from the window, and she saw it, beneath the title and the authority: exhaustion. Deep, grinding exhaustion. "My mother-in-law, the Countess of Oldwick, has been campaigning for me to remarry since before my wife's memorial flowers had wilted. She selected a candidate, Lady Marguerite Voss, the woman you saw in yellow. Connected, wealthy, impeccable lineage. The woman who called me this girl. The very one. My mother-in-law has arranged dinners, orchestrated encounters, practically announced an engagement that doesn't exist. And Lady Marguerite believes she has a claim on my future because my dead wife was her closest friend." The bitterness in his voice was raw enough to make Sable flinch. "I need a shield, Miss Renfield. Someone whose presence makes the pursuit impossible to continue. Someone temporary." The word hung in the air between them like a verdict. Temporary. "And when it's over?" Sable asked. "You return to your life with generous compensation, and my gratitude, enough to settle whatever debts your family carries." Sable's mind raced. The debts, Dashiell's debts, accumulated through disastrous investments, guided by his friend Thomas Kirke, were substantial. The mending brought in barely enough for food. The catering work paid for coal and candles. "You're asking me to lie," she said, "to an entire society, for months. I'm asking you to perform. There's a difference." "Is there?" His gaze held hers. "Think about it carefully, Miss Renfield. You have until tomorrow morning to decide." She didn't sleep. The room she shared with her mother above the chandler's shop in Bethnal Green was small and cold, and Sable lay in the narrow bed, turning the Duke's offer over and over, examining every facet, every flaw. She thought of his face when he'd made the offer, the calculated precision. There had been no warmth, no appeal to emotion. He'd assessed her the way one might assess a piece of furniture: functional, adequate, and available. It should have offended her. Instead, it made her trust him more than charm would have. Charm was what Thomas Kirke used on Dashiell. Charm was what the landlord used when the rent was late. Charm was a mask, and Sable had learned to distrust masks. The Duke hadn't bothered with one. He'd told her exactly what he wanted and why. She was a tool, a means to an end, and the honesty of that was almost refreshing. Almost. By dawn, she'd decided. By 7, she dressed in her best day dress, a faded blue cotton rehemmed twice, and told her mother she had an errand. "You look frightened, Sable." "I look determined. There's a difference." The Duke's London residence was a 3-story stone townhouse on a quiet square that probably cost more than every building on her street combined. Sable felt like a sparrow in a hawk's nest. A footman answered the door and regarded her with studied neutrality. "May I help you, miss?" "I'm here to see the Duke of Thornmere. My name is Sable Renfield. He's expecting me." Whether the Duke was actually expecting her was debatable. He'd said she had until tomorrow morning. It was tomorrow morning. She was choosing to interpret that as an invitation. The entrance hall was marble and mahogany, portraits ascending the staircase like a genealogy lesson in oil paint. It smelled of beeswax and old money, and the particular kind of silence that only existed in houses where noise was considered vulgar. "Miss Renfield." He appeared at the top of a curved staircase in a charcoal morning coat and no waistcoat. She noticed the absence and wondered if he'd simply abandoned them after yesterday. "You're early." "You said tomorrow morning. It's tomorrow morning." "I meant a civilized hour. It's 7:15. "Civilized hours are for people who can afford to waste daylight, Your Grace." The ghost of a smile crossed his face, quickly suppressed. In his study, He gestured her toward a chair and took one himself, not behind the desk, but across from her. Equal footing. This mother-in-law, Sable began. Tell me about her. Vivian Astaire, Countess of Aldwych, my late wife Cecily's mother. She spent the past 14 months inserting Lady Marguerite into every corner of my life. She's redecorated 3 rooms in this house without my permission. She redecorated your house? Arrived one Tuesday with an army of upholsterers while I was at Parliament. I came home to new curtains and a woman who told me I should be grateful. That's not thoughtfulness. That's a siege. Precisely. And Lady Marguerite is her battering ram. Pleasant enough in isolation, but weaponized by the Countess into something I can't escape through conventional means. Every polite refusal is reinterpreted. Every absence is explained away. The only thing that might work is the appearance of a viable alternative. Someone I'm publicly pursuing, making the Countess's campaign untenable. And your wife, Cecily, how long ago? Harlan's hand stilled. 16 months. And you loved her. He was quiet. Then, carefully. Cecily was kind. Everyone adored her. Our marriage was content. It wasn't a grand passion. It was a partnership that worked. And when she died, the world expected me to shatter. I didn't. That's what they can't forgive. That I grieved quietly instead of spectacularly. So, they decided you needed managing. The Countess, most of all. She lost her daughter and channeled her grief into controlling what remained. Me, this house, my future. I understand the impulse. But I will not marry a woman I don't love, simply because my mother-in-law needs to believe her daughter's life had a continuation. All right, Sable said. I'll do it. You need help, and I need my family to stop drowning. My brother owes money to dangerous people. My mother works herself sick. I haven't bought new shoes in 2 years. You offered compensation. I need it. That's the truth, and I'd rather say it plainly than pretend this is something noble. Most people would have dressed it up. Most people haven't had to choose between bread and coal, Your Grace. Honesty is cheaper than performance, and I'm already going to be performing enough. Fair point. You'll be presented as a connection through my household. Recently arrived in London at the family's invitation. You'll attend events at my side and allow society to draw its own conclusions. How long? The remainder of the season. 10 weeks, perhaps 12. 10 weeks of being temporary. What happens if your mother-in-law investigates? She'll find the daughter of a naval captain, a respectable family fallen on hard times. No scandal. You've already looked into my background. I needed to be certain you weren't a risk. And am I? His eyes held hers for a beat too long. That remains to be seen. Then we have a deal, she said, extending her hand. He took it. His grip was firm, warm, and lasted 2 seconds longer than it needed to. We have a deal, Miss Renfield. She's only temporary, he murmured. That's all this is. Of course, Your Grace. Temporary. But even as she said it, she felt the words settle between them like a dare, like the first line of a story neither of them knew how to finish. Sable was halfway down the front steps when she stopped, turned, and walked back inside. The footman, who had just begun closing the door, regarded her with the carefully blank expression of a man who had seen everything and was paid handsomely to react to none of it. I need to speak with His Grace again, Sable said. I forgot something. She hadn't forgotten. She'd walked out of that study with a handshake and a deal, and it had taken precisely 12 steps for her to realize she'd agreed to the destination without negotiating the route. Her father, Captain Renfield, who'd navigated 3 oceans and never signed a contract he hadn't read twice, would have been appalled. Harlan was still in the study, standing at the window with his hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the square with the fixed expression of a man watching something invisible. He turned when she re-entered, and she caught it, just for a moment, a flicker of something unguarded in his face. Surprise, maybe, or the faintest edge of relief. "Miss Renfield, I thought we'd concluded." "We concluded your terms. We haven't discussed mine." His eyebrow rose. "You have terms. You're offering me compensation and a temporary role. I'm offering you my reputation, my discretion, and my ability to convince 60 suspicious aristocrats that a tea server belongs among them. That's a skill, and skills have conditions. Go on. First, my mother receives a letter on proper stationery, confirming I've accepted a respectable position as a companion to a member of your family. Something she can hold in her hands and stop worrying. Done. Second, my brother Dashiell is not involved in any way. He's terrible with secrets and entangled with a man named Thomas Kirke, who would sell information about this arrangement before the ink dried. Agreed. Mr. Kirke has already come to my attention. He's not a man I'd willingly invite into my affairs. Third, when this ends, I want more than money. I want a future. Letters of reference, introductions to families who might need a governess or a companion. A path forward that doesn't lead back to serving tea. He was quiet for a long moment. She could see him weighing it. Not the cost. Money was meaningless to him. But the implications. References meant connections. Connections meant his name attached to hers in perpetuity, long after their arrangement dissolved. References from whom? He asked carefully. Not from you. That would raise questions. From whoever in your household or social circle can plausibly vouch for me. If I'm to spend weeks among these people, I'll make impressions. I want those impressions documented. You've thought about this. I've been awake since yesterday, Your Grace. I've had nothing but time to think. He studied her, and she held his gaze without flinching. This was the part that mattered. Not the dresses or the events or the performance, but what she'd carry away when the curtain fell. She'd learned from watching her father lose everything that the only things worth having were the ones that couldn't be repossessed. "You're negotiating with a duke," he said, and there was something in his voice, not condescension, not irritation, but a note she couldn't quite name. "You need me as much as I need this arrangement. That makes us equals in the only way that matters." The silence stretched. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Your mother will receive a letter today. Your brother will be kept at a distance. And when this concludes, I'll personally ensure you have every reference and introduction you need to build whatever future you choose." He paused. "There's one more thing. I have a younger sister, Odette. She's 19, lives here, and will almost certainly become your closest ally. She's also incapable of keeping a secret for longer than 40 minutes, so calibrate accordingly." Noted. "She's going to adore you. That's not a compliment. She adores everyone. Try not to let her redecorate your life before you've had breakfast." It was the most human thing he'd said to her, almost warm. She took his hand. His grip was steady, certain, entirely measured. But his thumb brushed the inside of her wrist as he released her, so briefly it might have been accidental, and the sensation traveled through her like a current, impossible to ignore. She left the study on slightly unsteady legs, descended the staircase past the portraits of stern-faced Ashcrofts, and stepped into the pale morning light. Temporary, she reminded herself, as she walked toward the waiting street. Everything about this is temporary. She just needed to make sure she remembered that. The carriage arrived at noon the following day, black and glossy, with the Thornmere crest, a stag, and a laurel wreath in silver. It looked so violently out of place on her narrow, soot-stained street that Mrs. Cobbett from the ground-floor flat pressed her face against her window and didn't move until the horses had pulled away. She'd packed everything she owned into a single trunk. It hadn't taken long. The ride from Bethnal Green to Mayfair was a journey measured not in miles, but in worlds. The streets widened, The buildings grew taller, cleaner. The air changed. Less coal smoke, more cut grass and horse leather. By the time the carriage turned onto the quiet square where Thornmere House sat in dignified pale stone, Sable felt as though she'd traveled to a foreign country without ever leaving London. Thornmere House was 3 stories of Georgian symmetry, tall windows reflecting the afternoon sky, a black iron railing enclosing a small front garden where someone had planted lavender. Mrs. Dalworth, the housekeeper, steel-haired, severe, led her to the Primrose Suite on the 2nd floor. The room made her breath catch. Soft yellow walls, white moldings, a bed with cream linens, and a coverlet embroidered with primroses. A writing desk positioned beneath a window that overlooked the back garden. A wardrobe that could have housed her entire family. An adjoining sitting room with its own fireplace. And a shelf of books. Books. He'd put books in her room. His Grace selected those himself, Mrs. Dalworth said. Last evening. He spent an hour choosing titles. There's Byron, Wordsworth, several novels, and a volume of naval history. Naval history. Because her father had been a captain. The detail was so unexpectedly thoughtful that she had to turn away before the emotion showed on her face. She sat on the edge of the bed, and the mattress gave beneath her with a softness that made her throat ache. She hadn't slept on anything this comfortable since she was 14, before her father's ship went down and took their world with it. Don't cry, she told herself fiercely. Don't you dare cry over a mattress. A knock at the door saved her. You're here. You're actually here. The girl who burst through was a storm wrapped in muslin. Dark copper hair like her brother's, but wild where his was governed, tumbling around a face of freckles and enormous green-gray eyes. She seized both of Sable's hands before introductions were possible. I'm Odette. Harlan told me everything. Well, not everything. He's dreadful at explaining things. And I think this is the most brilliant plan anyone has ever conceived. You're going to save us from that ghastly countess. I'm not sure save is the right. It absolutely is. You have no idea what it's been like. She rearranged our morning room. Mother chose those curtains before she died, and the Countess replaced them with something in mauve because she said the old ones were depressing. Mauve. As if grief could be cured by upholstery. The indignation was so genuine, so fierce, that Sable almost smiled despite herself. I've already sent word to Madame Colette. She's the best modiste in London. She's coming tomorrow for measurements. We'll need day dresses, evening gowns, gloves, and shoes. She glanced at Sable's feet with sympathetic dismay. Several pairs of shoes. Sable looked down at her boots, rizzled twice, scuffed beyond repair, and felt the familiar burn of shame. I know what you're thinking, Odette said, her voice suddenly gentle. But there's no shame in worn shoes, Sable. There's only shame in people who judge others by them. And anyone who does that at the Aldershot supper will answer to me. It was such an unexpectedly kind thing to say that Sable's throat tightened. Don't thank me yet. Wait until you've survived dinner with our grandmother. Your grandmother? Odette's expression shifted to something approaching a grimace. The Dowager Duchess of Thornmere. She lives in the East Wing. She observes everything. She approves of almost nothing. And she is going to want to inspect you like a horse at auction. Dinner was a quiet affair. Just Sable, Harlan, and Odette in a dining room that could have seated 30. Harlan sat at the head of the table, formally dressed, formally postured. He asked Sable 2 questions. Whether her room was satisfactory, and whether she'd found the books. When she said yes to both, he nodded and returned to his meal in silence. Sable glanced at him and saw the weariness of a man who'd been carrying weight so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. She wondered if anyone in this house actually looked at him. Not the Duke, not the title, not the grief-stricken widower. At him. She looked away before he caught her staring. Odette filled the void, mapping out the social calendar with the precision of a battlefield commander. The Aldershot supper, the Whitcomb garden party, the Marchioness of Loden's annual ball. That's where the Countess will make her move, Odette said darkly. She always does. Last year she cornered Harlan at the Loden ball and practically announced his engagement to Marguerite in front of 40 people. He had to pretend he'd been misunderstood. What did Lady Marguerite do? Smiled. That's what she always does. Smiles and waits and lets the Countess do the work. She's not stupid, Marguerite. She's just patient. And patience is more dangerous than ambition because people don't see it coming. Morning brought the Dowager. She was tall, silver-haired, ramrod straight, with a posture that suggested she'd been born with a steel rod where her spine should be. She wore dove-gray silk with a cameo at her throat, and her eyes, the same pale green as Harlan's, but colder, more assessing, swept over Sable with the efficiency of a general surveying newly claimed territory. So, she said, and the single syllable carried the weight of a verdict. You are the girl. Sable curtsied, properly, the way her mother had taught her during long-ago lessons that had seemed pointless at the time. Your Grace, I know who you are. I know what you are. And I know why you're here. My grandson believes he's being clever. It's not a terrible plan. But it depends entirely on you, and I don't yet know what you're made of. Would you like me to tell you? I would like you to sit down and stop looking like a rabbit in a snare. If I intended to throw you out, I'd have done it before you finished your toast. Sable sat. The Dowager studied her with an intensity that felt like being read, not observed, but parsed. My grandson says you're the daughter of a naval captain. Lost at sea, 14 years ago. And your mother? Takes in mending. Sews until her hands bleed, then sews more. She's the strongest person I know. Strength born of desperation is common. Strength born of choice is rare. Which is yours? Both, Your Grace, depending on the day. The Dowager reached for the teapot with unhurried precision. Let me tell you something about my grandson that he will never tell you himself. When his father died, my son, Philip, Harlan was 26. He married Cecily 6 months later because it was expected, because his grief made him pliable. He didn't love her, not the way a man should love his wife. But he was good to her, faithful and kind. And when she died, he grieved not for a great love lost, but for a life half lived, for the fact that he'd done everything correctly and felt nothing. Why are you telling me this? Because the Countess believes my grandson is mourning a passionate love. She's wrong. He's mourning the absence of one. And that kind of grief makes a man vulnerable to anyone who offers even the imitation of something real. I'm not here to exploit his vulnerability, Your Grace. Perhaps not intentionally, but proximity has a way of complicating even the most businesslike arrangements. The Dowager set down her cup. I will be watching, Miss Renfield. And if I determine that you are a threat to my grandson's well-being, I will remove you from this house so efficiently you'll think you dreamed the whole thing. She paused at the door. The Aldershot supper. Wear the burgundy. It suits a dark-haired woman. And it says, I am here on purpose, which is exactly what you need to communicate. She swept from the room, and Sable sat alone, her toast growing cold, thinking about a man who'd married correctly and felt nothing. A man mourning the absence of love, not the loss of it. She didn't know why that hurt, but it did. The Aldershot supper was held in a candlelit dining room that seated 40, with crystal that threw rainbows across white linen. Sable sat near the center, between a cheerful baronet who talked about horse breeding and Odette, who kept up a whispered commentary on every guest. The burgundy gown, the Dowager had been right, drew the attention Sable needed. Elegant without being showy, It made her feel, for the first time since entering Harlan's world, like she wasn't wearing a costume. Harlan sat at the opposite end of the table, too far for conversation, but close enough that she felt his awareness like a thread pulled taut. When their eyes met over the rim of a wineglass, he held her gaze for a beat before looking away. Then Lady Marguerite Voss arrived. She was late, deliberately so. She wore pale gold silk, her blonde hair in an elaborate arrangement. She moved through the room with the serene confidence of a woman who had never questioned whether she belonged. "Miss Renfield," Marguerite said, taking the seat across from Sable. "How delightful. I understand you're staying at Thornmere House." "I am. Lady Odette has been wonderfully welcoming." Odette is sweet. The word landed like a scalpel. She collects people the way some women collect ribbons, always picking up strays. "I wouldn't call myself a stray," Sable said evenly. "Strays wander in by accident. I was invited." "Of course you were. By Odette." The implication was precise. Odette had invited her, not Harlan. "By the family," Sable corrected gently. "But I appreciate your interest in the specifics." After dinner, Harlan appeared at her side so smoothly it seemed choreographed. "You survived the table," he murmured, guiding her toward the drawing room, with his hand hovering, not touching, at the small of her back. "Lady Marguerite called me a stray. She calls everyone something. It's her particular talent, the perfectly aimed diminishment disguised as observation. She's good at it. She's had practice." He paused at the threshold. "The Countess is here. I didn't expect her tonight. She must have arranged it with Lady Aldershot. She'll approach you, and when she does, she doesn't fight with insults. She fights with sympathy. Dance with me," he said. They joined the floor for a waltz. Every eye swung toward them like a compass finding north. "They're staring," she said. "They were staring before we started dancing. At least now they have a reason." His hand was warm at her waist, steady. She could feel the strength of his lead, not forceful, but absolute, the kind of guidance that made following feel like choosing. Her palm pressed against his, separated by the thin barrier of her glove, and she was acutely aware of every point of contact. "You're counting," he observed. "I'm praying." "For what?" "Not to step on your feet in front of 40 people and confirm every suspicion they already have about me." Something happened to his face. It took her a moment to recognize it, because she'd never seen it before. Not in the study, not at dinner, not in any of their careful interactions. He smiled. Not the ghost smile she'd glimpsed before. A real smile, sudden and unguarded, that transformed his severe features into something startlingly warm. It lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then it was gone. "Don't do that," she said before she could stop herself. "Do what?" "Smile like that and then put it away, like it's something you're not allowed to have." The waltz ended. Before she could respond, the Countess materialized. Vivienne Astaire was not what Sable had expected. Small, soft-spoken, with a face that radiated warmth and eyes that missed nothing. She took Sable's hands with gentle firmness. "Miss Renfield, may I steal you for a moment? I'd love to get to know the young woman who's captured our dear Harlan's attention." Our Harlan, the possessive, sent a chill down Sable's spine. The Countess guided her to a quiet alcove with sherry and settled in with the ease of someone preparing for a long, intimate conversation. "You must think I'm awful," she began, her voice soft with self-deprecation, "cornering you like this. But I've been so curious about you, and Harlan is so private that extracting information from him is like drawing water from stone. I don't think you're awful, my lady. You're kind, but I know what people say about me, that I'm meddling, that I'm trying to control Harlan's life. Perhaps I am. But you must understand, Miss Renfield, I lost my daughter. Cecily was everything to me, and Harlan was the last piece of her I had left." The grief was genuine. Sable could hear it, feel it, recognize it as something real and aching. This wasn't performance. The Countess had loved her daughter, and that love had metastasized into something consuming. "I'm sorry for your loss," Sable said, and meant it. "Thank you. You're the first person in months who said that without pity in their voice." The Countess sipped her sherry. "I don't bear you any ill will. You're lovely and intelligent. I can see why Harlan finds you refreshing." Refreshing. Not captivating. Not the woman he loves. Refreshing. Pleasant in the moment, easily replaced. "But I worry," the Countess continued, leaning forward with tender concern. "Not for Harlan, he'll be fine. But for you, Miss Renfield. This world is not kind to women who reach above their station. Society has a long memory and very sharp teeth. When this fascination runs its course, and it will, where will you be? What will you have?" Each word was wrapped in velvet and tipped with steel. The Countess wasn't threatening her. She was offering a vision of the future. Sable discarded, forgotten, returned to her small life with nothing but memories of a world she'd been allowed to visit, but never to keep. And the worst part, the part that made her hands tighten around her glass, was that the Countess was right. Every beautiful dress and elegant room and charged glance across a dinner table was borrowed, and borrowed things always had to be returned. "I appreciate your concern, my lady," Sable said, proud of how steady her voice came out. "But my arrangements are my own." "Of course they are." The Countess smiled, warm, genuine, patted Sable's hand, rose, and glided back to the party as if the conversation had been nothing more than two women sharing a pleasant chat over sherry. Sable sat in the alcove alone and felt the foundations of her borrowed life tremble. Odette found her. The Countess? She was very kind. She's always kind. That's what makes her terrifying. Sable looked across the drawing room to where Harlan stood, and as if sensing her gaze, he turned. Their eyes met, and something in his expression, unguarded, raw, made her heart clench with a feeling she had no right to have and no idea how to stop. She looked away first, but the damage was done. She avoided the library for 2 days after the Aldershot supper. It wasn't difficult. Thornmere House was large enough to disappear in, and Sable had become skilled at timing her movements to miss Harlan's. Breakfast before he came down, reading in the garden when he was in his study, retiring early when he lingered after dinner. She told herself it was strategy, maintaining the boundaries of their arrangement, keeping the transaction clean. She knew it was fear. On the third evening, rain drove her indoors. The garden was awash of gray and silver, the fountain overflowing, and her sitting room felt too small for the restlessness pacing through her. She needed a book, something absorbing, something that would quiet the thoughts she couldn't stop having. The library was the obvious answer, and she'd been avoiding it long enough. She found Harlan there, of course, because the universe had a sense of humor, and apparently it was pointed. He sat in one of the leather chairs by the fire, a ledger in his lap, his pen poised over a column of figures. He'd removed his jacket. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and she could see the tendons in his forearms shift as he wrote. It was an absurdly mundane observation, a man doing accounts, and it shouldn't have made her pulse quicken. But it did. "I can leave," she said from the doorway. "You always say that." He didn't look up. "And I always say, stay. We should consider saving time and skipping the preamble." She entered the room, acutely aware of the door closing behind her. The fire popped and settled. Rain streaked the windows. The library smelled of leather and cedar and old paper, and it felt, as it always did, like a place where the rest of the world couldn't reach. She selected a book without really seeing the title and settled into the chair opposite his. For several minutes, neither spoke. The only sounds were the scratch of his pen, the turn of her pages, and the rain. "You've been avoiding me," he said. I've been respecting the boundaries of our arrangement. He set down his pen. The Countess upset you at the Aldershot supper. She told me the truth, Your Grace, that this is temporary. She wasn't cruel about it. She was compassionate, which is worse, because cruelty I can dismiss. Compassion I can't. Her compassion is a weapon. That doesn't make it wrong. I am temporary. We agreed on that. The problem isn't what she said. The problem is that I'd started to forget it. Harlan stood, moving to the window. My father used to say that the most dangerous thing about comfort is how quickly it becomes necessary. Are you calling me a comfort? I'm calling you necessary. The word came out rough, as if he hadn't meant to say it. And that terrifies me, because nothing in our arrangement accounts for necessity. Tell me about your father, she heard herself ask. Philip Ashcroft was the worst duke in 3 generations, and the best man I've ever known. He hated politics, despised social obligations, and spent most of his time in this library reading philosophy. The estate nearly bankrupted under his management. My grandmother never forgave him. But you loved him. More than I've ever loved anyone. The admission was raw. He died 4 years ago, a riding accident. He lived for 3 days. Long enough to tell me he was proud of me, which I didn't deserve, and to ask me to look after Odette, which I've done badly. You haven't done badly. She's 19 and has no suitors, because every man in London is terrified of me. I've been told I have a way of looking at people that suggests imminent violence. You do. He turned, and there it was, the ghost smile. You're not supposed to agree. I'm not supposed to do any of the things I've been doing since I met you. She stood. I poured tea on you, pressed a napkin against your chest, negotiated with you before breakfast, and I'm sitting in your library after dark discussing your father. None of this is in the terms of our arrangement. They stood on opposite sides of the fireplace, and Sable felt the boundary they'd drawn bending under a weight it was never designed to bear. Good night, Your Grace. Harlan, he said. When we're alone, when it's just this room and the fire, and no one performing for anyone. My name is Harlan. Good night, Harlan. She left on unsteady legs and stood in the dark of the Primrose Suite, pressing her hands against her chest as if she could hold her heart in place. The next morning, a package appeared on her writing desk. A slim volume of Keats, leather-bound, margins filled with annotations in Harlan's hand. A note slipped from between the pages. You said you wanted stability and security, but I think what you actually want is beauty. Here's some to keep, regardless of how temporary everything else may be. H. Sable read the note 3 times. Then she placed the book on her nightstand, where it would be the last thing she saw before sleeping and the first upon waking. She was in so much trouble. The Whitcomb Garden party was croquet on the south lawn, refreshments under a white marquee, and enough aristocratic tension to power a steam engine. Sable wore ivory linen with lace at the collar, and Odette had threaded white flowers through her dark hair until she looked, according to Odette, like a painting that wandered off the wall. Something had changed since the library. The distance between them had taken on a different quality, charged rather than empty, electric rather than hollow. You look distracted, Odette observed, appearing with lemonade. I'm observing. You're staring at my brother. There's a difference. There really isn't. He's staring back. It's nauseating and wonderful. Odette squeezed her arm. Alice told me you keep a book on your nightstand, that you read every morning, with an expression she described as like someone holding a love letter. They're pretending is just a book. Alice talks too much. Alice is observant. Just be brave, Sable. That's all I'm asking. When she looked up, Harlan was crossing the lawn toward her, with an expression she hadn't seen before. Intent without calculation. Focused without artifice. He looked like a man who'd made a decision and was walking toward its consequences. "Come with me," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Where?" "Somewhere without an audience." He led her through a gate in the garden wall, down a path bordered by hedgerows that opened into a small walled garden. A kitchen garden, she realized, with herbs and climbing roses, and a wooden bench beneath an arch of wisteria. The sounds of the party faded to a murmur. Here, they were invisible. "This isn't appropriate," Sable said, though she didn't move toward the gate. "Nothing about us is appropriate. We passed appropriate the moment you poured tea on me, and I decided to rearrange my entire life around it." "You hired a temporary—" "Stop." The mask was gone. Not slipping, not cracking. Gone. "Stop calling yourself temporary. Stop pretending you don't feel what I feel, because I can't do this alone. I can't stand in rooms full of people and watch you and pretend it's performance." That was the arrangement. The arrangement was a mistake. The words fell between them like stones into water. "You don't mean that." "I mean every word. Somewhere between the library and the waltz, and the way you told my grandmother you wouldn't exploit my vulnerability. Somewhere in there, I stopped performing and started wanting." "Wanting what?" "You. Something that isn't a transaction or a duty. Something I chose for no reason other than wanting it." "You can't want me. I'm a tea server's daughter in a borrowed dress. You're the only person in my life who sees me. Not the title, not the estate, not the widower who needs managing. You see me. And I didn't know how much I needed that until you started avoiding me, and the house felt like a crypt." Instead of pulling back, she said, "I read your note 14 times. His expression fractured, not with pain, but with something fiercer, rawer, closer to relief. 14? I stopped counting after that. He cupped her face in his hands, his palms warm against her cheeks. "I'm going to kiss you," he said, "and it won't be for an audience." He kissed her beneath the wisteria, with the scent of thyme and roses around them, and the distant sound of a string quartet playing something she'd never be able to hear again without feeling his mouth against hers. It was slow and searching and achingly gentle, nothing like the precision that defined everything else about him. His hands moved to her hair, dislodging Odette's carefully placed flowers, and she didn't care. Her fingers found his lapels and held on as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet, because it had. When they broke apart, breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "This changes everything." "I know." "The Countess will be relentless." "I know." "My grandmother will have opinions." "Your grandmother always has opinions." He laughed, that real laugh, surprised out of him. And the sound did something to Sable that she knew she'd never recover from. This man, this careful, grieving man, laughing because of her, because she'd made him laugh. "We need to talk about what this means," he said, pulling back to look at her. "Properly. Not here. Not with 50 people waiting. Tonight. The library. The library." He touched her face once more, a gesture so tender it made her ache. "After dinner." They returned to the party through separate gates. Sable's lips were swollen, and there were flowers missing from her hair. Odette's grin could have lit the entire garden. "My brother just walked past Lady Marguerite without seeing her, which has never happened in the history of his extremely polite existence. I think the arrangement has been renegotiated." Sable said nothing, but she was smiling, and she couldn't stop. The library meeting never happened. Because at dinner that evening, the Countess of Aldwych was sitting at the table. She'd arrived unannounced, a social maneuver so bold it bordered on warfare, with Lady Marguerite and a trunk of belongings, having informed Mrs. Dalworth that she'd be staying to sort some of dear Cecily's remaining affairs. Cecily's rooms, still untouched 16 months after her death, because Harlan hadn't been able to face them. And now the Countess was going to open that wound in the middle of dinner, with witnesses, with sympathy. "Of course," Harlan said, his voice perfectly neutral. "You're welcome to stay." Sable watched his hands beneath the table. His knuckles had gone white. The next 3 days were a siege wrapped in silk. Everywhere the Countess went, she left traces of Cecily. A portrait moved from storage to the morning room, a shawl draped across a chair. Stories told at dinner about Cecily's kindness, Cecily's grace, Cecily's hopes for the future. "She always wanted children," the Countess said one evening, looking directly at Harlan with eyes bright with unshed tears. "She told me she imagined this house full of them." Sable saw it, the flinch, quickly mastered. The guilt of a man who'd been good to his wife but hadn't loved her enough, and now had to sit at his own table while her mother painted a picture of a future that never existed. Lady Marguerite, through all of this, remained a patient, perfectly calibrated presence. She wore Cecily's favorite color, soft lavender, and styled her hair the way Cecily had worn hers. She deferred to the Countess with filial devotion, helped sort Cecily's things with gentle hands, and looked at Harlan with quiet understanding that said, without words, "I knew her. I loved her too. I can keep her alive for you. It was brilliant, and it was working." Sable could feel Harlan retreating, not physically, but emotionally. The walls she'd watched him lower in the library, in the walled garden, were going back up, brick by brick. On the second night, Sable found him in the library at midnight, sitting in the dark. No fire, no lamp, just him in the leather chair, staring at nothing. "Harlan, go to bed, Sable. Not until you talk to me." The garden was a mistake. The words hit her like a slap. I was selfish. I let myself want something I have no right to want, and I put you in an impossible position. The Countess is right. This ends, and when it does, where does that leave you? Used and discarded by a duke who should have known better. You don't get to decide what I feel. I'm deciding what's responsible. You're deciding what's safe. There's a difference. Her voice shook, but she held her ground. You're retreating because the Countess came in here with your dead wife's shawl and your dead wife's friend and your dead wife's dreams, and instead of fighting, you're doing what you always do. You're enduring. The silence was absolute. "Get out," he said. Not angry. Worse. Empty. She stood there for 3 heartbeats. Then she turned and walked away. She packed in the morning. Alice watched with tears streaming down her face, making no effort to hide them. "Please don't go, miss. He doesn't mean it. He means it, Alice. And even if he doesn't, I can't stay in a house where She stopped, swallowed. "I can't stay. Please help me pack." She left the beautiful dresses, left the pearls Odette had lent her, left the writing desk and the flowers and the soft sheets that had made her cry the first night. She kept only 2 things, the Keats and the burgundy dress, because it was what she'd been wearing when he first truly smiled at her, really smiled, and she couldn't bear to leave that behind. She wrote 2 letters, one to Odette. "Dear Odette, you were the first person in this world who treated me like I belonged. I'll carry that kindness with me forever. Don't be angry with your brother. He's protecting himself the only way he knows how. Love always, Sable." And one to Harlan. She wrote it 6 times before settling on words that didn't betray too much. "Your Grace, I'm returning home. Our arrangement has concluded earlier than planned, but I believe its purpose has been served. Thank you for the books, which I will treasure. Please don't contact me. A clean end is kindest for us both. Yours with gratitude, Sable Renfield." She sealed both letters and left them on the writing desk. Then she walked down the staircase, past the portraits of 4 generations of Ashcrofts, past Cecily's gentle painted face at the landing, past the marble entrance hall that smelled of beeswax and old money. The dowager was standing at the foot of the stairs. So, you're running. I'm leaving. There's a difference. There really isn't. The Countess wins then. She has grief and loyalty, and 16 months of mourning on her side. I have a borrowed dress and a 10-week contract. You have my grandson's heart, you foolish girl. Sable's composure cracked. Just for a moment. Just enough for the dowager to see the devastation beneath. Hearts are temporary, too, she whispered. Everything is. She walked past the dowager, through the front door, and into the waiting carriage. She didn't look back. Home was smaller than she remembered. Or perhaps she was larger. The modest rooms above the chandler's shop felt like a place she'd outgrown, and the guilt of that feeling sat on her like a stone. Her mother held her, and didn't ask questions. Dashiell hovered with the anxious guilt of a man who suspected he'd contributed to whatever had gone wrong. Her father's portrait watched from the mantel with the steady, knowing gaze of a man who'd navigated storms and understood that some of them happened on land. She tried to settle back, helped with the mending, stitches neat and mechanical, marketed, counting coins with fingers that remembered silk gloves, read the Keats every night, pressing her palm against the pages Harlan had annotated, touching the words he'd touched, and hated herself for the weakness of it. On the third day, she put it in the bottom of her trunk beneath her winter things. On the fourth day, she took it out again. On the fifth day, Thomas Kirke appeared at the door. Miss Renfield, you look well. Country air agrees with you. I live in Bethnal Green, Mr. Kirke. There's no country air for miles. The Duke of Thornmere sent me. Sable gripped the doorframe. No. He was quite insistent. Desperate, actually, which is not a word I typically associate with a man who could buy half of London. Whatever he wants, the answer is no. I left a letter. The arrangement is concluded. He's not sending me about the arrangement. Thomas's expression shifted, something almost genuine beneath the habitual charm. He sent me because he's done something rather dramatic, and he wants you to know about it before you hear it from anyone else. Despite every instinct screaming at her to close the door, Sable asked, What has he done? In order? He's dismissed the Countess of Aldwyck from Thornmere House, personally, to her face. Told her that while he honored Cecily's memory, he would no longer allow her mother to weaponize it against him. The Countess left in tears and fury, and has apparently been telling everyone in Mayfair that the Duke has lost his mind. Sable's breath stopped. He then informed Lady Marguerite, again personally in his study, that he harbored no romantic interest in her whatsoever, that he never had, and that any impression to the contrary was entirely the Countess's construction. Lady Marguerite took it rather well, actually. I think she was relieved. Being a battering ram is exhausting. He didn't. Oh, there's more. Thomas's voice softened. He went to your mother. The world tilted. What? 3 days ago. Arrived in a carriage that caused Mrs. Cobbett to nearly break her window pressing against it. Sat in your parlor for an hour. Spoke to your mother privately. Asked her. Thomas paused, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked genuinely moved. Asked her permission to court you. Properly. Not as an arrangement. Not as a performance. As a man who loves her daughter and wants the right to tell her so. Sable's knees buckled. She caught herself on the doorframe, her vision swimming. Your mother, Thomas continued quietly, apparently said, and I'm told this is a direct quote, if my daughter is brave enough to love a duke, I won't be the one to stop her. But you tell her yourself, because she needs to hear it from someone whose hands aren't always reaching for other people's wallets. He grinned. I believe that last part was directed at me. She said that? Your mother is a formidable woman. I see where you get it. He straightened. There's one more thing. He settled Dashiell's debts, all of them, quietly, through my channels, so your brother thinks he won a streak at cards, which he did. The cards were just cooperating. Sable pressed her hands against her eyes, trying to process, trying to think through the roaring in her ears. "He's burned his bridges," she said, half to herself. The Countess, Lady Marguerite, the entire social structure he was trying to protect. Burned them, salted the earth, and stood in the ashes looking like a man who'd finally stopped carrying a weight he should have set down years ago. Thomas reached into his coat and produced a sealed letter. "He wrote you this. Asked me to deliver it and leave. No pressure. No schemes. Just a letter and a choice." Sable took the letter with trembling hands. The seal was the Thornmere stag, pressed in dark green wax. "For what it's worth," Thomas said, stepping back from the door. "I've known many men with power. Most of them use it to take. This one used it to let go." He tipped his hat. "Good day, Miss Renfield. Whatever you decide, I hope it makes you happy." He left, and Sable stood in the doorway holding a letter that weighed nothing and meant everything. She opened it in the narrow room she shared with her mother, sitting on the edge of the bed, her hand shaking so badly the paper trembled. "Sable, you told me once that honesty was cheaper than performance. So here is the honest truth. You are not temporary. You were never temporary. I said those words the day we struck our bargain, and they were the most dishonest thing I've ever spoken. From the moment you walked back into my study to negotiate your own terms, before breakfast, in a faded blue dress, with the audacity to tell a duke that his needs didn't outweigh yours, I knew. I knew you were something I hadn't prepared for and couldn't manage and wouldn't recover from. I love you. Not your performance, not your usefulness. You. The woman who reads Keats and counts dance steps and tells me not to hide my smile. The woman who made me want to be present in my own life for the first time since I can remember. I've sent away the Countess. I've released Marguerite. I've visited your mother and settled your brother's debts, so that if you come back, if you choose me, it will be because you want to, not because you need to. I've removed every obligation except desire. Come back. Or don't. But know that if you don't, I'll spend the rest of my life in a library full of books I chose for a woman who made the room feel less empty. Yours. Not temporarily. Harlan." She pressed the letter against her chest and let the tears come. The real ones, the ones that felt like something breaking open rather than apart. Her mother found her and held her without speaking. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know." "Yes, you do." And the terrible, wonderful truth was that she did. The carriage carried her through darkening streets toward Mayfair. Sable sat with Harlan's letter in her lap and her heart in her throat and the absolute certainty that she was either about to make the best decision of her life or confirm every fear she'd ever had about wanting things she couldn't keep. Thornmere House blazed with light. Every window glowed, and as the carriage pulled up, Sable could see movement inside. Servants rushing, candles being lit, the particular energy of a household preparing for something. Alice met her at the door, eyes red and face radiant. "Miss! Oh, miss, you're here! He's been— Where is he?" "The library. He hasn't left it in 2 days." Sable was already moving. Through the entrance hall, past the portraits, up the stairs, through the corridor. She'd walked so many times that her feet knew the way without her eyes. She pushed open the library door without knocking. He stood at the window, his back to her, his posture rigid with the particular tension of a man braced for bad news. He was in shirt sleeves again, his hair disordered, as if he'd been running his hands through it for hours. "Harlan." He turned, and the expression on his face, the raw, devastating hope, held in check by the fear that hope was premature, made her forget every careful thing she'd planned to say. "You came," he said. "I came. Sable, Don't." She crossed the room in 4 strides and took his face in her hands, the way he'd held hers in the walled garden, her palms against his jaw. "Don't explain. Don't apologize. Don't be careful. I'm always careful. I know, stop. She kissed him, not gently, not tentatively. This was urgent, almost fierce. The kiss of a woman who'd spent 5 days convincing herself she could live without this, and knew now, with absolute certainty, that she couldn't. He made a sound against her mouth, broken, grateful, and his arms came around her with a strength that lifted her off her feet, pulling her against him as if the distance between them had been a physical pain, and proximity was the only cure. When they finally broke apart, breathing ragged, he said, I meant every word. I know you did. I love you. I know that too. I love you back, and it terrifies me, and I don't care. He laughed, that real laugh, the one that transformed him, and pulled her closer. The Marchioness of Loudon's ball is in 3 days. I want to walk in with you, not as an arrangement, as the woman I'm courting, publicly, irrevocably, with full knowledge that it will create the kind of scandal that keeps society columnists employed for months. Your grandmother will have opinions. My grandmother, said a voice from the doorway, has been standing here for 45 seconds, and already has several. The Dowager entered the library. You left, she said to Sable. Yes. You came back. Yes. Why? Because he wrote me the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me. Because my mother told me that running doesn't make the wanting stop. Because I spent 5 days trying to go back to who I was before him, and I couldn't. Not because of the dresses or this house, because of him. The man who put naval history in my room because my father was a captain. The man who laughs like he's surprised he still can. The Dowager looked at her grandson, who stood behind Sable with a vulnerability he'd never shown to another soul. Your father wrote you a letter, the Dowager said quietly. Before the riding accident. He left it in his desk. I kept it because I wasn't sure you were ready. She produced a folded paper, yellowed with age. Read it later. When you were with her, which I suspect amounts to the same thing now. She straightened. I don't approve of the scandal this will cause. But I do approve, her voice caught, of the way you look at her. Your father looked at your mother that way. I spent 30 years thinking it was weakness. I was wrong. The Marchioness of Loudon's ball was 400 guests, a ballroom draped in white silk and ivy, an orchestra imported from Vienna, and enough candlelight to be seen from the Thames. Everyone who mattered was there, and everyone who mattered was watching the entrance. Sable stood at the top of the grand staircase in a gown of deep midnight blue, commissioned by the Dowager from Madame Colette, with the instruction, make her look like she belongs, because she does. The fabric was silk, overlaid with delicate silver embroidery that caught the light like stars. At her throat, a sapphire pendant the Dowager had pressed into her hands that afternoon, with the words, it was Harlan's grandmother's. She would have liked you. She was difficult, too. Ready? Harlan murmured beside her, offering his arm. He wore black evening dress that made him look severe and beautiful, and entirely hers. No. Good. Neither am I. They descended the staircase together, and the whisper started before they'd reached the 3rd step. Sable could see the Countess near the refreshments, her face a composed mask. Lady Marguerite beside her, looking surprisingly serene. Odette near the dance floor, practically vibrating with anticipation. They reached the ballroom floor. The orchestra was playing, couples already moving. But Harlan stopped in the center of the room and turned to face her. Miss Sable Renfield, he said, his voice carrying with the quiet authority that silenced the nearest conversations, which silenced the ones beyond, which silenced the ones beyond that, until the ripple of quiet had spread across the entire ballroom. Will you honor me with this dance? In the weighted hush of 400 watching eyes, it was a declaration of war against every expectation, every convention, every whispered prediction that she was temporary. She placed her hand in his. The honor is mine, Your Grace. The orchestra shifted into a waltz, and they took the floor alone. Sable didn't count steps. She didn't pray. She looked into Harlan's eyes and let him lead, and they moved together as if they'd been doing this for years instead of weeks, as if the music had been written for the way their bodies fit. "Everyone's staring," she whispered. "Let them stare. Let them talk. Let them write about this in every society column in London." His hand tightened at her waist. "I want them to see." "See what?" "That you were never temporary. That the Duke of Thornmere fell in love with a woman who poured tea on him at a charity luncheon and then had the audacity to negotiate terms before breakfast, and that he'd do it all again, every moment, every scandal, because she made him brave enough to choose." Sable's eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. Not here. Not yet. Other couples joined the floor, the spell gradually breaking, but neither Sable nor Harlan noticed. They moved in their own orbit, and when the waltz ended, he didn't release her. "I love you," he said, quiet enough for only her to hear. "Not because it's convenient or expected or appropriate. I love you because you are the most extraordinary thing that has ever happened to me, and I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you know it." Is that a proposal? It's a promise. The proposal comes later, when I can do it properly, without 400 eavesdroppers. I don't need proper. You deserve it. Across the ballroom, Sable caught the dowager's eye. The old woman stood at the edge of the crowd, her expression complicated. Pride and fear and love and the fierce, reluctant surrender of someone who'd spent a lifetime believing duty mattered more than happiness, only to discover she'd been wrong. The dowager raised her glass, just slightly, just once, but it was enough. 4 months later, Sable stood in the library at Thornmere House, her library now, cataloging the collection that had been neglected for years. She was reshelving naval history when a folded paper slipped from between the pages of an atlas of Atlantic shipping routes. Philip's letter, the one the dowager had given Harlan. He'd tucked it into a book about the sea, near the things that reminded him of her father, of fathers in general, of men who left too soon and loved imperfectly and did their best. She read it. "My dear boy, if you found this, then I've gone ahead without you, and I'm sorry. Sorry for the burden of the title. Sorry for being a philosopher when you needed a strategist. But I am not sorry for showing you what love looks like, even though it cost me. Your mother was the bravest choice I ever made. Because love, Harlan, real love, the kind that rewrites you, isn't safe. It isn't strategic. It's messy and terrifying, and it demands everything you have. And in return, it gives you the only thing worth having, a reason to be present in your own life. Find someone who makes you brave, who pulls you out of your study and your careful existence, and hold on to her. The title can wait. The estates will manage. But love doesn't wait. It arrives on its own schedule, usually at the worst possible time. And if you're too busy being appropriate to notice, it moves on. Don't let it move on, my boy. Be brave. Your loving father, Philip. Sable pressed the letter against her chest, overwhelmed by a man she'd never met, who had somehow written her a blessing from beyond the grave. Harlan found her there. "You found it," he said softly. "It was in the naval history section. I think you put it there on purpose." "I might have." He took her hands, letter and all. "He would have loved you. He told me to find someone who makes me brave. I did. You found someone who poured tea on you. Same thing." She laughed, and he pulled her close, and they stood together surrounded by books and memories and the quiet certainty that this was real. The Countess had reconciled herself with pragmatic grace. Lady Marguerite was courting a Viscount from Derbyshire and seemed genuinely happy. Odette had declared herself Sable's official sister and was planning a wedding that would require military logistics. The dowager remained the dowager, sharp-tongued, imperious, and calling Sable my granddaughter in public, which she claimed was merely practical, though no one believed her. Dashiell had found legitimate work through Thomas Kirka, who'd reformed just enough to be useful and not quite enough to be trustworthy, a balance that suited everyone. And Nell Renfield had been installed in a comfortable cottage near Thornmere's country estate, where she tended a garden and read letters from her daughter, and no longer sewed until her hands bled. And every year, on the anniversary of the charity luncheon where it had all begun, Harlan and Sable attended Lady Ashwick's spring event together. Sable wore the burgundy dress, the original one, taken in and let out as years required, and Harlan wore a dove-gray waistcoat. And every year, without fail, Sable poured him a cup of tea. Carefully, deliberately, into his cup and not down his front. Though once, on their 3rd anniversary, she missed on purpose. He smiled. That real smile, the one she'd first seen at the Aldershot supper, the one that still made her heart stutter after all this time, and pulled her close, tea-stained waistcoat and all. Temporary, he murmured against her hair. Permanent, she corrected. And that, as it turned out, was the only word that mattered. Thank you for being here. You're the reason these stories exist, because you believe in love that chooses courage over convenience, in characters who fight for happiness, despite every voice telling them it's impossible, in endings that feel earned because they are. Your presence makes this space what it is, and I'm grateful for every moment you spend with these characters. If a line stayed with you, if a scene made your heart race or your eyes sting, I'd love to hear about it. Your engagement helps me understand what moves you, what keeps you listening, and what kinds of stories to bring you next. If you'd like more romances with emotional depth and genuine character growth, consider subscribing. Thank you for being here. You make this community what it is.